the passenger in seat 17B. Where on earth do I know her from? I searched my memory, going through all the women I knew. Step by step, I considered them. From my neighborhood, the gym, friends of my family, work. One by one, I ruled them out. But deep down, I knew I had seen her before. It bothered me that I couldn't figure it out. I despised unsolved mysteries. I despised them because my mind would keep working on them, even in the middle of the night when I should be sleeping. I observed as she took off her coat and placed it in the overhead bin, along with her carry-on bag. She glanced in my direction, and though she smiled vaguely, I couldn't see any recognition in her eyes. Maybe I was mistaken about knowing her, but something told me I wasn't. I settled into my seat, annoyed at the anonymous staff member who had given me a middle seat instead of one by the window or aisle. Mystery Lady had managed to get a window seat without any trouble. Once again, I studied her profile, hoping to trigger a memory of when and where I had met her. I continued to observe her through the gap between the seats as she rummaged in her handbag. Eventually, she took out her phone and placed it on the empty seat beside her. Leaning forward, her dark hair falling across her face, she carefully placed her handbag under the seat in front of her. She straightened up, retrieving her phone from the seat next to her. I looked away, wanting to respect her privacy as she entered her PIN to unlock her phone. When I glanced back, I couldn't help but smile. I finally had the answer to my mystery. The screen of her phone displayed a smiling photo of her with none other than Jonathan Carstairs, the head of our engineering department. Thanks to Jonathan, I had the position of installation head. He was the only person who saw past my act of downplaying my intelligence. He was there for me when Sue betrayed Carl, her boss, just as I was there for him when his first wife cheated on him. He had often told me that whenever he felt down, he would remember my famous line to Sue, "So why did you do that?" and it would instantly make him feel better. He had guided and mentored me throughout my years at the company, taking me on his journey up the corporate ladder. Many times we had sat side by side at his desk, reviewing plans, and I had seen the photo of him with his wife, Priscilla Carstairs. She looked a little older now, with longer hair, but it was definitely her. I felt satisfied and relieved. Mystery solved. I thought about reintroducing myself. We had met a few times in the early years when she still attended work events, but her lack of recognition earlier made me doubt it. I wasn't surprised Priscilla had always preferred mingling with management rather than the employees. If she had been seated next to me, I would have reminded her of our previous encounters. However, with her sitting in front of me, I decided against it. The conversation would be awkward, and even though the flight wasn't fully booked, which was unusual for a Friday flight to Brisbane, I didn't want to inconvenience the flight attendants by requesting a seat change. I opened my book of crosswords and, with the intention of taking one final glance, reached for my pen in my shirt pocket. But I froze halfway, almost standing up, only to be stopped by the seatbelt. There, on her screen, in vivid color, was a photo that most definitely wasn't Jonathan. For one, the guy in the photo was black, and he looked much younger than Jonathan. I couldn't picture Jonathan taking a selfie with his jeans unzipped and grasping an erect. Well, let's just say it was NSFW. Words on the screen burned into my memory. Hurry up, sweetheart. In my mind, there was only one interpretation: she was on her way to meet someone secretly. She was just another unfaithful spouse. I couldn't help but feel sympathy for Jonathan. He didn't deserve this. Not again. If anyone knew what a dedicated family man he was, it was me. At a glance at his office, anyone could see how much he loved his wife, children, and grandchildren. Well, her children, technically. They weren't even related by blood. Jonathan had adopted them and treated them as his own. I didn't care about her reasons. I didn't care if she thought he was distant, boring, a workaholic, or thoughtless. There was no excuse. If she was unhappy in her marriage, she should have worked through their issues or ended things before pursuing someone else. Old pain, old anger, and old disappointment resurfaced unexpectedly. My protective instincts kicked in, and my hand continued reaching for my pocket, but instead of grabbing my pen, I grasped my phone. For a brief moment, doubt crept into my mind. What if Jonathan already knew about his wife's actions and accepted them? I quickly dismissed that thought. Jonathan was too much of a stand-up guy to tolerate something like that. As if to reinforce my belief, my eyes were drawn to her left hand. I grimly smiled. She had removed her wedding ring and even covered her ring finger with a band-aid to conceal any signs of wearing a ring. Perhaps she thought it was a sign of respect for Jonathan and their marriage. But in my eyes, removing the ring didn't make her any less of a cheater. Jonathan was a good man. He deserved better than an unfaithful wife. He didn't deserve a foolish woman, and that's what she must be. Or maybe she was simply clueless. Jonathan would never forgive her if he found out. Not with his history. Not after what happened with his first wife. Memories of his drunken rants came flooding back. I won't let that bitch and her loser boyfriend steal my house and move him in. She will be shocked when she sees that I won't let her take everything we've earned. But she did take everything. Thanks to a biased judge who seemed to believe all men were terrible and needed to be punished, she took Jonathan to the cleaners, leaving him with nothing but the rundown cottage his mother had left him. In fact, witnessing how Jonathan got mistreated in court inspired me to make sure Sue couldn't do the same to me. I discreetly took a photo of her screen and zoomed out to capture her profile as well. I was unsure what to do with the photos. Part of me wanted to send them immediately to Jonathan. But another part hesitated. One didn't want to be the bearer of such devastating news. His first divorce had nearly destroyed him, and it took him years to even consider dating again, let alone trust someone new. I put my phone away. There was now a fellow passenger beside me, and I didn't want him to suspect anything about me taking photos of Priscilla without her knowledge. The 2-hour flight felt like an eternity. Every time I stole a glance at Priscilla through the gap, I couldn't help but feel a surge of anger and an urge to email Jonathan about her betrayal. But every time I pictured Jonathan's face in the months after his first divorce, I held back. I remembered his proud smile when he showed me the latest photos of his adopted children, or their children. I heard the happiness in his voice when he talked about being called Grandpa for the first time during his last visit. He loved his adopted kids with all his heart. It would destroy him to lose them and their children. Did I have the right to do that to him, considering all he had done for me? Did I have the right to keep such pivotal information from him? And would he even lose his family if he found out? I had always been a decisive person. I had proven that countless times in both personal and professional situations. So why was I struggling so much with this decision? The answer was simple. To prove my loyalty to a man I owed so much to, I would be taking away a significant part of his happiness. Was I willing to do that? Was I willing to let it be? What would I want Jonathan to do if he were in my shoes? The answer was clear. I would want the problem to disappear and never come back. And so, a solution to my dilemma started to form. But there was one missing piece I had to figure out if Mrs. Carstairs actually cared about Jonathan, or if this was her way of leaving the marriage. If it was the latter, were her plans to ambush Jonathan already in motion? If I warned him now, would it soften the blow when everything eventually came crashing down? After all, he was only a few years away from retirement. Uneasily, I developed a plan that would cover all grounds I deemed necessary. It would minimize my interference, easing my conscience, and at the same time, protect my friend and mentor from either an unfaithful wife or another ambush. It would also leave the final outcome somewhat in the hands of fate, which appealed to my optimistic beliefs. I would give her a chance to reveal her true intentions, to show her cards. I would give her an opportunity to minimize the damage that had already been done. I would give her the chance to return to being a faithful wife. I would offer her a choice, something I suspected she hadn't given Jonathan. And if her actions proved she didn't want that, then Jonathan would be informed. Priscilla, I positioned myself into the corner, pressing against the small window so I could sneak another look at Paul's photo without risking the guy next to me seeing it. Paul looked incredible. It wasn't that his smile was any wider than Jonathan's curvaceous. In fact, Jonathan's probably had more teeth, but the happiness was a novelty after all my years with John. Paul's abs, now those were impressive. Not that Jonathan wasn't in good shape, but Paul had 25 years on him and there was no competing with that. Paul knew he was good looking. It was evident in the confidence of his pose. It was attractive and intriguing, and I definitely felt intrigued. As the plane leveled off, I discreetly glanced to the side, confirming the guy in the seat next to me already had his nose in the latest Dan Brown bestseller. Good, I wouldn't need to discourage conversation. I stared at Paul's handsome smile and abs a moment longer, locking the image in my mind and then switched off my phone. Smiling, I closed my eyes and let my mind wander back to my last rendezvous was with Paul. We'd organized to meet in Sydney at a little BB overlooking the harbor for our first all-nighter. Sydney was neutral ground where neither of us was likely to bump into anyone we knew. The passenger in seat 17 billion. If it weren't for my current situation, I would have enjoyed a silent chuckle at my fellow travelers. It always amazed me that in the instant the fasten seatbelt sign went off, the way there was a mass leap by all and sundry into the aisle, the mad scramble to retrieve carry-on luggage from the overhead lockers, despite the then lengthy wait to actually exit the aircraft. Normally, I waited until the plane was almost empty before collecting my own gear, but as my plan required me to keep Priscilla within a relatively short distance ahead, I joined the rest of cattle class in the aisle. By allowing the gentleman who had been seated beside me and the passengers across the aisle to organize themselves first, I managed to position myself 4 people behind Priscilla. She'd shown no signs of recognizing me earlier, but I didn't want to take any chances on that being a distracted fluke on her behalf. I maintained my distance as we crossed the aerobridge into the terminal. As I suspected, she headed for the baggage claim. Women like Priscilla always took luggage. The carousel was idle, the cargo not yet unloaded. My target scanned all the faces in the hall before turning her gaze toward the exit. She tapped her foot impatiently and looked at her wristwatch. As soon as the first bit of luggage began rolling around, her gaze alternated between the carousel and the exit. When her face lit up like a Christmas tree, and she even took one step toward the doors as she raised her arm to wave, I turned to look in the same direction. I couldn't contain a snort of derision. How cliché, her partner looked considerably younger than I knew Priscilla to be. I waited as he hastened toward her, hoping their greeting would give me an indication about whether this was a first meeting or one in a long line of meetings. My stomach dropped. I closed my eyes, allowing a gust of breath to exit noisily. The lovers and I now knew that is exactly what they were displayed: no signs of shyness, no awkwardness, no fumbling. For a brief moment I questioned my plan. The person was as guilty as hell, but thoughts of Jonathan, now in his 60s, having to survive a second spouse betraying his love and trust kept me on course. Decision reaffirmed. I discreetly photographed their passionate embrace. Sliding my phone into my pocket, I strode toward the pair, and while she was still encased in his arms, their lips locked, I tapped her on the shoulder. I heard the wet slurp of their lips disengaging and shuddered in disgust. Even after the many years since Sue and the divorces I'd witnessed due to a cheating spouse among colleagues and friends, I still couldn't understand how one partner could so sorely betray someone they had promised to love and cherish. To me, it was still the worst kind of betrayal one partner could perpetrate on the other. Excuse me, I almost smiled at my banal words. Mrs. Carstairs, you demonstrated on the plane that you don't remember me, but unfortunately for you, I do remember you. Her twirl to face me coincided with a gasp from her companion. Mrs.? We both ignored him. Who are you? She demanded, probing my features. Then, as I watched, her eyes half swiveled toward her beau. Was that worry he'd just learned something she wanted to remain hidden in her eyes? It was only a fraction of a second before her attention returned fully to me. I could almost hear the cogs of her brain churning through memories, trying to place me. I suppressed a smile when no light of recognition dawned in her gaze. Sadly for her, she was like so many born to privilege and didn't take notice of those she felt beneath her. Who I am is irrelevant. Who you are, on the other hand, is most relevant. Or, should I say, who you are married to is. Married? Scylla? Piped in Loverboy. You said you were divorced and have been for years. Paul, honey, please give me a moment. I can explain. I'm separated, have been for a long time. My ex just doesn't want to accept we're over and has stalled the divorce. I watched as he scanned her face, his uncertainty as clear as a neon sign. I thought about confirming his doubts, but I wanted her choice to be genuine and not decided by Loverboy storming out on her. Anything less would be unfair to Jonathan. Please give me a moment with Mr. She paused, waiting for me to provide my name. I merely raised an eyebrow and replied, Dave. Just give me a moment with, Dave, to sort this out, and then we can enjoy our weekend as planned. She was convincing I'd give her that. Had I not listened to Jonathan talking about their upcoming trip to visit their child in Perth as recently as earlier in the week, I'd have believed her. Loverboy nodded reluctantly. I could feel his eyes on my back as Priscilla grabbed my forearm and steered me out of earshot. Now, not that it's any business of yours, but as I said, I'm separated. I appreciate your concern for my soon-to-be ex-husband, but I really must insist you leave me alone and not interfere in things that don't concern you. I was tempted to applaud her, she was that good an actress, but I kept my game plan in the forefront of my mind. She had to choose freely and without any pressure. Wow, you're good, I said, smiling kindly for the benefit of Loverboy. So, if you're so distant, Who is Jonathan taking to Perth next week to visit Jared?" She gasped and looked at me more closely. I could feel her annoyance at herself for not being able to remember me. Regardless, she was now aware I knew Jonathan well enough to know his plans. "I'll cut to the chase, Priscilla. I'm going to give you a choice. One you should consider carefully." "Yes, a choice and an opportunity. What on earth are you talking about?" She was impatient. Her attitude irritated me, and once again I questioned giving her a chance to save her marriage. By giving Jonathan a chance to avoid pain, I was offering his wife a chance she didn't seem to deserve. I gathered myself and thought, I'm doing this for Jonathan, not her. I'm talking about giving you a choice between Jonathan and your friend. I'm talking about giving you the opportunity to save your marriage and spare your husband unnecessary pain. He rescued you and your children from a difficult situation, and this is how you repay him. She paled and for the first time looked unsure of herself. It was then that I realized I had been witnessing a facade for the past 2 minutes. She wasn't the self-assured woman in complete control. She was a terrified wife about to have her world shattered. Ah, not so distant after all, I see. What do you want? Nothing. I want nothing from you. In fact, it's the other way around. I'm giving you something that, frankly, I don't think you deserve. But against my better judgment, I'm giving you the chance to avoid Jonathan finding out about your friend over there. I'm giving you a chance to save your marriage. Her shoulders sagged slightly, but since she was standing to the side of her friend, I doubted he would notice. What do I have to do? You don't have to do anything. Weren't you listening? I'm giving you a choice. She nodded, and I smiled. It's nearly midday now. I'm giving you until 4:30 Melbourne time to call me from the 03 area code to confirm that you're back in Melbourne. If I don't receive your call by then, I'll send Jonathan an email with these 3 attachments. I took out my phone from my pocket and quickly opened the folder containing the 3 photographs I had taken of her. "Oh gosh," she mumbled, closing her eyes. Please don't. Jonathan will be devastated." "You really need to learn how to listen better, Priscilla. I said you have a chance to avoid being discovered. You have until 4:30 local time in Melbourne. Considering daylight saving, you have a little more than 3.5 hours to get back home, but it's nearly midday. That's not enough time. Oh, it will be tough, but there are a few direct flights that will get you there in plenty of time." And there were, as long as she left her friend and luggage behind and immediately purchased her ticket. "Here's my card. Call me on my cell phone no later than 4:30, and the email and attachments will never leave my draft folder. Well, unless I suspect you're making a bad decision, like you have been recently. You call me by the designated time, and from now on, treat Jonathan as your husband deserves to be treated, and the email and photos will never see the light of day." She took my business card, read my name and title, and finally, I saw the moment of realization in her eyes. Yes, I was that Dave. As I watched, I saw her remember the story her husband had told her. Good, now she knew exactly how uncompromising I could be. At that moment, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a chauffeur holding up a sign with my name on it. I turned partially in his direction to wave at him, and when I turned back, Priscilla was lost in thought next to the baggage carousel. Her friend was walking towards her again. Glancing at my watch, I realized I didn't have time to stick around and see how things would unfold. It was going to be tight enough already to make it to my first meeting on time. From here on out, Priscilla's fate, and the fate of my best professional friend, was in her hands and the hands of fate. Priscilla Paul didn't exist for me once Dave had confronted me. I didn't bother explaining myself. All I managed to say to him was, "I have to return to Melbourne. Forget about me." My interaction with Paul showed me that I had no doubts about wanting to save my marriage. Despite our current circumstances, I loved Jonathan. Dave was right. Jonathan didn't deserve what I had been doing. All those years ago, Jonathan had saved me. He had been a knight in shining armor for both me and my children, and I was repaying him with betrayal. And all because Paul reminded me of Jerome, my first husband. Jerome, who had left me while I was still deeply in love with him. I should have hated him for abandoning me. Instead, I had always felt like I needed closure, an explanation as to why. Why, when I had done nothing but love and support him emotionally and financially? Why, when I had taken care of my appearance and would be with him at a moment's notice? I had never understood what I had done to drive him away. Somehow, my affair with Paul was a way for me to seek the closure that had been denied to me for almost 30 years. The fact that being with Paul made me feel young again, at 52 years old, when the upcoming birth of Jared's second child made me feel old, was just an added bonus. For the first time since meeting Paul, I felt shame for what I had done. Dave's words made me realize that all my justifications for the affair were meaningless. I glanced at my wristwatch. Time was passing too quickly. I scanned the carousel. My bag was nowhere in sight and made a quick decision. To hell with my new Victoria's Secret cloth. To hell with the little black dress I had bought specifically for this weekend. To hell with my phone charger. I left my luggage behind and walked as quickly as my ridiculously high heels allowed me towards the ticket counters. I had been born the daughter of a wealthy man, used to privilege and being treated with respect. But that meant nothing when a man in a three-piece suit raced past me, briefcase flying, to secure a spot ahead of me in line. As I waited with barely concealed impatience, my stomach twisting at the delay, memories I usually pushed away flooded my mind. Vague, barely there images of a mother I had never really known, as she had died when I was 4 years old. Would things have turned out differently if she had survived? Had she loved my father? I struggled to believe she did. He had always been strict and distant with me, never showing affection. Later, when I became a teenager, I realized he was also racist and snobbish, and those were some of his better traits. If he had been kinder and more encouraging, would I have rebelled as I did? Would I have fallen so hard for a man I knew my father would disapprove of? A young, half-Aboriginal ex-convict, coincidentally hired with money my father had provided to a local charity as a tax loophole. His name was Jerome, and he cleaned our pool. I had a relationship with Jerome. I became pregnant by him, and just despite my angry father, I married him. My father's reaction was as volatile as it was expected. As soon as I announced that abortion was not an option, he disowned me completely. I snapped out of my thoughts at the frustrated hair-rumping of the man in the three-piece suit. It only took me a moment to realize why he was expressing his annoyance. The couple currently being helped were Asian and clearly had limited English skills. The more I listened, the more my own frustration grew. Why couldn't they afford to have an additional employee to help behind the counter? Brisbane was a capital city, for goodness sake. My attention turned back to the man in the three-piece suit. He was looking left and right, checking out the other airline counters. That made me realize how foolish I was being. Why was I waiting in the Qantas line? Just because I had flown into Brisbane with them didn't mean I had to fly back to Melbourne with them. The man in the suit, taking a step in the direction of the Virgin Australia counter, made up my mind for me. I took off my heels, and ignoring the amused glances, I sprinted towards the Virgin counter, beating the man in the suit to it. He wasn't thrilled, but I didn't care. I would like a ticket for the flight to Melbourne departing at 5 minutes to 12, please. I have a few seats left on that flight, but the gate is closing soon. Do you have any luggage to check? No, none. I will need some form of identification. I handed her my driver's license and credit card, silently urging her to enter my information into the computer quickly. I've already checked you in, Mrs. Carstairs, but you'll have to hurry to make it to the gate on time. Here's your boarding pass. I took the boarding pass and hurried toward the departure gates, holding my handbag tightly to prevent it from moving too much. As I ran, I glanced down to check the gate number before looking up at the signs overhead. It felt like I was in a movie, like I was a character dodging and evading enemies. But deep down, I knew I wasn't innocent. I only hoped that my guilt wouldn't be punished by fate. When I saw the line at security, I groaned. I quickly chose what seemed to be the fastest moving queue, hoping it was the right choice. I placed my handbag in a plastic tray and removed my shoes, which had metal studs and buckles that could set off the metal detectors. I pushed the tray onto the conveyor belt and walked through the metal detector, but the alarm went off. Please remove your belt, I sighed, realizing that I still had to remove my belt. I walked back to the trays, unbuckling my belt and placing it in a tray. I went through the metal detector again and finally received a nod from the attendant. I didn't even think about putting my belt back on. I simply placed it in my handbag alongside my heels. Once again, I ran, grateful for the time I had spent jogging on a treadmill with my personal trainer. I skidded to a stop at the boarding gate, gasping for breath as I handed my pass to the attendant. You made it just in time, the attendant said with a smile, scanning my pass before returning it to me. Please use the back stairs as your seat is 23 billion. I nodded, still catching my breath. I grabbed my heels and hastily put them back on, adjusting the straps awkwardly. The only positive thing about arriving late for the flight was that most people were already in their seats with their carry-on luggage stowed, making it easier for me to find my own seat. I sank into my seat, feeling a wave of relief wash over me. I had made it. This flight would take me to Melbourne by 3:15, giving me plenty of time to contact Dave and prevent the exposure of my secret. As I relaxed, I turned my head to see who was sitting beside me. It was a young mother with a nursing toddler and a little girl with dark brown curls. Looking at those curls reminded me of my own daughter, Carly, when she was a toddler. She had curly black hair and her father's coffee-colored skin, giving her a Spanish look. Thinking about Carly as a baby brought back memories of other things too. Memories of the cleaning job I found shortly after bringing her home from the hospital. I looked down at my hands, which showed no signs of the hard work. Many manicures and hand creams had helped keep them looking nice. I didn't mind doing such menial work back then. With my father cutting ties with Jerome, we didn't have many options. Despite the low earnings, I thought we were happy. I certainly was. Moving from a mansion to a small trailer didn't matter to me. That trailer held more love than my father's huge house. We were so happy that I even fell pregnant again, and Jared joined our little family a month early after a difficult pregnancy. The month or two leading up to Jared's birth had been tough financially. I couldn't work due to the pregnancy, and the unemployment benefit we received barely covered the rent. But despite the difficulties, we were still happy. I let Jerome know I had no regrets, never complained even when I had to balance taking care of 2 kids with working. But it turned out that our happiness was just an illusion. Jerome, true to his Aboriginal heritage, was restless staying in one place. He talked about the outback and his grandfather's walkabouts, but I never thought he would actually leave us. One day, I came home from work to find Carly, who was 5 at the time, looking after Jared. Jerome, the car, and anything valuable, including my grandmother's brooch, were gone. Later, I discovered that he had emptied our bank account and left me in debt, not having paid the last month's rent for the trailer. The trailer park manager refused to listen to me or show any sympathy. No amount of tears could change his mind. Suddenly, the kids and I were homeless, going from having a humble and happy home to having nothing. That's when Jonathan found us. The voice over the intercom brought me back to the present. The flight was delayed by 30 minutes due to a missing passenger. I frowned and hoped there would be no further delays. Once the plane leveled off, I took out my phone and checked the weather forecast for Melbourne. The city was known for experiencing all 4 seasons in one day, and I didn't want any unexpected storms further delaying the flight. I was relieved to see that it was sunny with possible showers. With my mind no longer occupied by the delay, I let my thoughts wander back to the day I met Jonathan. I remembered how kind and concerned he was from the moment we met. He looked at me with his gentle gray eyes, and I felt an instant connection, an immediate trust. "Are you in some kind of trouble?" he had asked. Those words opened the floodgates, and I blurted out my story through tears. Carly and Jared joined in, and Jonathan somehow managed to calm all of us and make us feel safe. He didn't hesitate to help us, driving us to the trailer park to gather our belongings before taking us to his home. He even went grocery shopping for us, filling his refrigerator and pantry with food. It felt like Christmas. Sometime later, when I felt more comfortable and settled, I mustered the courage to ask Jonathan what he had been doing at the trailer park that day. I had been working as his housekeeper for a few weeks by then, and I knew he worked across town. I was on my way to list the granny flat for rent with the real estate agency across from the park, he had explained. As panic overcame me, he reassured me by patting my hand and saying, "Don't worry, Priscilla. It's much better to have you and the kids here." This arrangement has been beneficial for both of us. I come home to a clean house and a home-cooked meal. And freshly laundered clothes too, I added, needing him to know how much I did for him. "Yes, that too," he replied. Thinking about those early days with Jonathan brought tears to my eyes. He never treated me like a charity case or a beggar. He was always generous and supportive, trusting me with his house, and even letting me do shopping for both households. I could have taken advantage of him, could have run off with his money or harmed him in some way, but I never did. And yet now, nearly 30 years later, I had stabbed him in my own way. My mind recoiled from the truth. I had only been with Paul 4 times. It wasn't love, it was closure. It was a way for me to say goodbye to my youth. Jonathan doesn't know, and I hope he never finds out. I will make it up to him. The movement of the plane and the pilot's announcement interrupted my thoughts. I checked my watch and realized we were now 40 minutes behind schedule. I frowned, hoping there wouldn't be any more delays. Once the plane had stabilized, I took out my phone again and checked the weather forecast for Melbourne. The city was known for its unpredictable weather, so I wanted to make sure nothing unexpected would further delay the flight. Seeing that it was sunny with a chance of showers, I relaxed. I went back to my thoughts, pondering over whether Jonathan had any clue about my brief affair. If he didn't know, then it couldn't hurt him. I just had to keep it a secret. What harm had I really done? After nearly 30 years, I had a brief fling. It wasn't a threat to Jonathan or our marriage in any way. I never once thought about leaving Jonathan while I was with Paul. In fact, being with Paul made me feel young and attractive again. Jonathan had benefited from my revived desire. What's the worst that could happen? If Jonathan found out, I would have to beg for his forgiveness. He loves me, and he wouldn't want to lose me or the kids. It might take time and it might be difficult, but he would eventually forgive me. I pondered on that for a while. But what if he didn't forgive me? What if he kicked me out? We had a prenuptial agreement that stated if either of us cheated, we would leave the marriage with very little. But I quickly dismissed that thought. The agreement was made nearly 30 years ago, and there have been recent cases where prenuptial agreements were overturned by the courts. Besides, I couldn't imagine Jonathan wanting to see me penniless and homeless. He was the type of person who would come to the rescue, not seek revenge. And then there's Carly and Jared and their children. If he leaves me for one mistake, leaving me with no money to support myself, the kids will be angry with him. He'd be devastated if he lost them. He won't risk that no matter how angry he is with me. Again, my thoughts drifted to the past. I closed my eyes and saw Carly and Jared's face when we came home from doing the grocery shop to find Jonathan had set up a small playground, compete with swing, slide, and jungle gym for them in the backyard. How many times had I looked out the window to see Jonathan pushing one or the other of them on the swing? Too many to count. Same with the pool he had put in when they were a little older. How many times had I watched him play and splash around with them? So many that one blended into the other. He'd been a great father, patient but firm, and always giving of his time. He'd never missed a soccer game, school event, or birthday. He loved my children, always had and always would. Of that I was sure. And now we had grandchildren, and I knew for a fact he loved being a grandfather as much as he loved being a father. He'd be heartbroken if Carly and Jared cut him out of their lives and that of their children, and that's probably what would happen if he divorced me and left me without any money. Family, after all, being stronger than anything else. He wouldn't risk it. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became. I may have to swallow my pride and make amends to Jonathan to win him over and restore his pride, but I wouldn't lose him. And if by some strange luck I was wrong, well, then I'd fight it out with Jonathan in the courts. I'd live with Carly and her husband Jack, and I'd explain my youth and situation as a young single mother, as having left me no choice but to sign the prenup. I'd been a good and loving wife to him for nearly 30 years. The courts wouldn't let him kick me out with nothing. Again, the tinny voice of the pilot over the intercom system brought me back to reality. With his words, my chest felt empty, as if my heart had dropped into my stomach. More delays. A medical emergency flight heading for Melbourne meant all other incoming flights had to wait. How long would that take? Please God, no longer than 20 minutes. That will leave me 20 to get off the plane and find a landline to call Dave from. Each minute with no update was nerve-wracking. The time seemed to pass too quickly. In my mind, I saw an hourglass with the sand running out, creating a pyramid at the bottom. I checked my watch. 15 minutes had passed. I didn't know whether to cry or scream. "Miss, when will the pilot land this plane?" I asked the young flight attendant testily, grabbing her arm gently to get her attention. "Excuse me?" she asked, smiling. I asked, "When will we be landing?" "These delays are just too much. What kind of airline is this? I have an important AAA appointment to keep, and if we don't land soon, I will be late." "Ma'am, it's a Royal Flying Doctor flight we're waiting on." That means a patient with a critical injury or illness, probably a life or death situation. "I'm sorry, but aviation rules say that has to take priority over passenger schedules, connecting flights, entitlement, or any other reason they may be traveling." "We appreciate your understanding, sheesh," I thought, forcing a smile onto my face. The minutes seemed to fly by, and yet each second held 1,001 thoughts and feelings. "Hello, this is John Smith, your captain. I have good news and bad news. The good news is the Flying Doctor flight has landed. The bad news is, as we fueled up in Brisbane, we're being asked to wait until flights low on fuel land. We estimate a further 20 or so minute delay. We appreciate your patience. Oh no. The words burst from me without thinking, loud enough to draw the attention of surrounding passengers. The looks directed at me ranged from amused to disapproving. I looked down, embarrassed, staring at my wristwatch, doing the math. At best, the delay meant I'd only have 15 minutes to get off the plane and find a phone. At worst, 5 minutes. This was cutting it too close. I had to contact Dave. I needed to let him know about the delays. I bent over and retrieved my handbag from under the seat in front of me. Fighting panic, I searched for my cell phone. I'd send Dave a text message. He'd understand. He had to. I remembered that my phone's battery was low. I had noticed it earlier when I got text messages before takeoff. I pressed the on button. Nothing. No. It can't be dead. But it was. Why, oh why, hadn't I charged it before leaving? Why had I packed my spare charger in my suitcase instead of my handbag? Because you wanted to be able to truthfully say to Jonathan that you forgot to charge it, and that's why you missed his calls. A whimper escaped me as I pressed the on switch again, praying for a miracle. None came. What am I going to do? Please let us land in time for me to find a payphone in the terminal. I watched the clock, silently begging time to slow down until we landed. I searched each flight attendant's face, looking for any indication of when we would land. I silently pleaded with the pilots to announce that we were next in line. The wait was agonizing. My nerves were stretched to their limit. One more delay and I felt like I would snap. 4549-412 with each passing minute and no word from the airline staff. I fought harder to contain my panic. I don't want to lose my husband. I don't want to have to fight him in court. I don't want to have to explain to my children why their father and I are having problems. I want my old life back, the one where Jonathan looks at me with love and affection. 417, ladies and gentlemen, we are now making our final approach. We thank you for your patience during these unexpected delays, and I didn't hear the rest of the announcement. All that mattered to me was that we were landing. Finally, I slung my handbag over my shoulder. I planned on being the first one off the plane, even if I had to push past other passengers. The feeling of the plane descending was like a weight lifted off my shoulders. The sound of the wheels hitting the runway was music to my ears, the sound of the engines reversing like a beautiful symphony. As soon as the seatbelt sign turned off, I bolted from my seat, trying to make my way to the rear exit. They better allow us to disembark from the back of the plane. I could feel the waves of anxiety coming off of me. The other passengers, and even the flight attendants, avoided making eye contact. They probably thought I was crazy. They weren't completely wrong. The opening of the rear doors felt like a dam breaking, and just like a flood, I rushed down the stairs, hitting the ground running. I entered the terminal in a hurry, my eyes scanning for a public phone. I sprinted, ignoring the stares of other travelers, searching for a phone. As I neared the main terminal with the shops and restaurants, I saw one. Relief surged through me and gave me a burst of energy. I barely stopped in time to avoid crashing into the phone booth. A quick look at the phone showed that it accepted both credit cards and change, thank goodness, as I wasn't sure how much change I had in my purse. I retrieved my wallet from my bag, berating myself for not having it ready in my hand. 429, I inserted my credit card, holding Dave's card at eye level, and dialed his number. Credit card payments are temporarily unavailable from this phone. Please use change. The automated message made me want to scream. Instead, I groaned. I fumbled with my purse. All I had were a 50, 20, and 10-cent coins. I prayed it would be enough to complete the call. Again, I held the receiver between my shoulder and ear, while holding Dave's business card in one hand and dialing with the other. The call went straight to voicemail. Dave, I'm in Melbourne. There were the call cut off. No. God in heaven, no. I glanced at my watch. 4:32, my legs felt weak. I sank to the floor, still clutching the receiver. My life as I knew it was over. Dave was probably at this very moment talking to Jonathan, telling him about my mistake. Possible words and phrases that would fill his email crossed my mind, a mind too shocked to grasp any of them. I saw Jonathan's face clearly. His broken, sad face, tears running down his cheeks. I had only seen that expression once before, the time we almost lost Carly to meningitis. It was at that moment that I realized how much he meant to me, how much I loved and needed him. Guilt overwhelmed me. I had hurt him in the worst way possible, and on top of that, I had spent every moment since Dave confronted me trying to justify what I had done. Making excuses. What on earth have I been telling myself? Closure? Why would I need closure for a relationship where my children and I were not only abandoned, but left penniless and in debt? Worse, am I so obsessed with my appearance and needing attention that I seek validation from a younger person finding me attractive and desirable? It would seem so. How could I have even considered fighting Jonathan in court? How selfish can I be? How self-centered have I become? The thought of being on the opposing side of anything to Jonathan is just plain wrong. Have I, despite my best efforts, turned into my father? My stomach clenched violently again, so deep was my shame. Day 4, it said at the bottom corner of my laptop screen. I sighed, not knowing if it was lucky or unlucky that my afternoon meeting ended early, giving me time to think. Come on, Priscilla. Call, please call. I read over my email to Jonathan, making a few changes here and there, wishing that I could be deleting instead of editing. 4:07 I checked the volume and charge on my phone. I knew both were fine, but I needed something to do with my hands. I stared at the screen, hoping to see an incoming call. She should have arrived by now. I wasn't used to regret, but really cursed myself for not paying more attention and losing sight of Priscilla at the airport. If I had any indication that she had returned to her lover or rushed to the check-in counter, it would have made my decision easier. I passed the time by making a list of possible flight numbers she could be on. After eliminating the ones that had already landed, I was left with a short list. Please, I silently pleaded. Please don't make me be the one to break Jonathan's heart. Please love him enough to want to protect him from pain. Please want to save your marriage. 4:14 I groaned with frustration. With deliberate movements, I raised my coffee cup to my lips. I would have preferred to throw it against the wall, but I controlled myself. Call, you selfish, arrogant person. 4:19 I rolled my neck from side to side, trying to relieve the tension. It didn't help. I stood up and paced back and forth. It didn't solve anything, but it made me feel slightly better. 4:23 as I watched, the status of the last flight from Brisbane to Melbourne before 4:30 changed from delayed to landed. All other flights had been on the ground for at least 30 minutes. Call. Please don't make me destroy my friend and mentor. Call. Pacing was no longer effective. I was too wound up for the small office space I was allocated in Brisbane. I decided to do push-ups instead. 1. Should I go through with my plan? 2. It all came down to this. If she wanted to save her marriage and spare Jonathan from devastation, she would be in Melbourne by now. 3. If she called now, I would stay silent and not hurt my friend. I couldn't bear being the indirect cause of his unhappiness. 4. If she didn't call, it meant she had stayed in Brisbane. She had no interest in saving her marriage. She had already decided to leave Jonathan, and maybe even started taking steps to get the best outcome in their divorce. I managed a total of 20 push-ups, making a silent vow that if Jonathan was hurt, I would do everything in my power to support him. Emotionally, financially, or in any way he needed. 4:29 God damn you, you heartless cheater. I logged back into my laptop, which had gone idle. I was taken directly to my drafted email. My finger hesitated over the send button. I groaned. I couldn't do it. I couldn't deliver such news in such an impersonal way. 4:30 time seemed to slow down. I stared at the dreaded instrument in front of me. 4:31 I reached for my phone and found Jonathan's number in my recent calls. Hey Dave, how's Brisbane going? Hearing Jonathan's voice almost silenced me. Jonathan, I have some bad news, some information that I wish I didn't know. Silence hung in the air. Are you still there? Yes. Okay, go ahead. Did we lose the contract? I closed my eyes. Of course he assumed it was work-related. He trusted Priscilla. She and the kids were his top priority. No, buddy. Everything is great with work. This is about Priscilla. She was on the same flight as me this morning, sitting in the row in front. I then explained everything to him. Seeing the photo on her phone, witnessing her hug her lover, suspecting it wasn't their first time. The confrontation, the choice I offered her, her apparent decision. Throughout it all, Jonathan remained quiet. At the end, I asked if he wanted copies of the photos and pleaded him to support my decision. To the first question, he simply replied yes, please, his voice barely holding back his emotions. The answer to the second question was preceded by a few moments of silence. Thanks, buddy. You did the right thing. I have to go. The dial tone told me he had hung up. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by the sadness of my friend's situation. I finally hit send on my email. It concerned me deeply that I was so far away from Jonathan with no way to offer comfort or ensure that he didn't do anything reckless. Then, I scolded myself. Belinda, who had been by my side since Sue left, was at home just a short distance away from where my friend was hurting. I grabbed my phone and called her, a smile creeping onto my face. Belinda was indeed as intelligent as Sue had believed. She listened to the story and immediately started heading to her car. After obtaining the address, she ended the call. "Priscilla, are you okay?" The kind words from an elderly woman brought me back to reality. "Oh, yes. Thank you for your concern." I struggled to stand up, attempting to smile reassuringly at the old woman who continued to look at me with worried eyes. I turned towards the main terminal, pushing myself to think clearly and not let panic take over. A phone. I needed to find another phone that accepted credit cards and call Jonathan. Hopefully my call would reach him before Dave's email. Confessing to him directly would have to be better than him finding out from someone else. It took 2 tries to find a working public phone. I silently lamented the poor maintenance from the phone company as I dialed Jonathan's cell number. It went to voicemail. Leaving a message crossed my mind, but I ultimately decided against it. I wanted to speak to him directly. I knew Jonathan would be at home. He often worked from home on Fridays, so I called our landline. My heart sank when it went straight to the answering machine. Was I ever going to catch a break? Determined to have him hear the news from me first, I decided to confess everything. I knew I could explain in more detail once we were face to face. "Jonathan, it's me, Press. Honey, I've made a terrible mistake and I am so sorry for it. It wasn't your fault. It wasn't anything you did or didn't do. Oh God, I'm getting this all mixed up. This is so hard to tell you. I feel so ashamed. Oh God, Pat, I had an inappropriate relationship. It was only a few encounters with a younger man named Paul. I swear that's the truth. Love. Please believe me when I say I love you and only you. I was foolish, a foolish, selfish person. I know that, and I can't express how sorry I am. I was planning to meet him in Brisbane this weekend, but I bumped into your coworker. Dave, I can't remember his last name, and he made me realize how wrong and awful my actions were. I wish I could take it all back. I wish I could go back and make a different choice. Please forgive me. Please don't leave the abrupt beep cut me off." I had run out of time. I fumbled in my handbag to find a tissue and wipe away the tears that my confession had brought forth. "What do I do now, Pris?" I whispered to myself. "Go home," I answered. "Take a taxi home and beg on your knees like you've never begged before." Decision made, I headed towards one of the exits out of the terminal. Of course, there was a long line at the taxi rank. It was Friday afternoon, and everyone wanted to go home. Finally, it was my turn. I glanced at the driver and held back a groan. He was a Sikh. Please let him speak English well enough. I gave him my address in Carlton, and he nodded. The traffic on a Friday afternoon was terrible, and it felt like every traffic light turned red just as we approached. It seemed like I could have walked faster. Throughout the ride, I stared out the window, trying to hold back my tears, and prayed. I prayed with more desperation than ever before. Going over everything again and again, had the worst outcome changed with my confession and Dave's revelation? I knew better than anyone how deeply Jonathan was scarred from his first wife's betrayal. After all these years together, would he give me another chance, or would he kick me to the curb as well? If he kicked me out, would he be fair in the divorce settlement or show no mercy? If I had to fight for my rightful share of our assets, I was no longer sure if I would have the strength to do it or not. At last, we pulled over beside the letterbox to my house. Jonathan's car was in the driveway. At least he was home. I walked along the path like a condemned man to the hangman's noose. I steeled myself for Jonathan's anger, for the harsh words I was sure were headed my way. I deserved every angry word, every insult. All I could do was hope that by expressing the pain I had caused him, he would understand and give me a chance to make things right. Do I ring the bell or just let myself in? Taking a deep breath, I decided to use my key and let myself in until Jonathan said otherwise. This was still my home. The house was silent. I called out but received no reply. Was he ignoring me? Confused, I checked the kitchen and then the master bedroom and bathroom. No sign of Jonathan. My heart rate quickened. Where was he? His car was here. Had one of our friends come and picked him up? I walked to the formal dining and checked the backyard from the bank of windows. No sign. There was really only one more room where he might be, his study. I frowned as I stood in the doorway. He had definitely been in the room recently, but it was a mess which was out of character. Jonathan was usually a neat man. His chair was pushed back and to the side, and the small coffee table had also been moved. Papers were scattered across his desk, but also underneath, and that was unusual. Following the line of documents, I noticed the phone was off the hook. I frowned. That was odd. And then I saw the open answering machine, empty of its usual cassette. Panic gripped my heart. I had a bad feeling. I dropped my head to my chest, trying to calm my breathing, which had become shallow. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something sticking out from under the caster of Jonathan's office chair. I bent and retrieved it, struggling as it fought to stick to the carpet. A sticker. What would Jonathan need a sticker for? Laerdal HS1. What on earth is Laerdal HS1? I lowered myself into Jonathan's chair and rolled myself to a comfortable position in front of the PC. One tap of the keyboard informed me Jonathan hadn't logged off. I went to Google and typed in the name on the label. Oh my goodness, heart start 1 defibrillator. I leaned forward, accidentally nudging the mouse, and opened Outlook. He had emailed the kids. I scanned a couple of lines, but the only word that registered was prenup. I shook my head. There would be time later to worry about the kids, knowing what a fool I had been. Right now, I needed to get to Jonathan. I needed him to know how terribly sorry I was, how much I loved him, and how much I needed him to fight to live. I opened a new Google page, searching for the nearest hospital. With trembling hands, I called and asked if Jonathan had been admitted. My worst fears were confirmed. Jonathan was in ER. He had had a heart attack. I rushed to the kitchen, grabbing my car keys from the hook before racing into the garage. Waiting for the garage door to rise enough to allow me to back out was agonizing. I typed the hospital's address into my onboard navigation as I drove, praying for Jonathan's survival the whole time. Please don't let him die. What the heck happened? Jonathan was as fit and as strong as an ox. He always passed his company's regular medical exams as if he were 15 years younger than his actual age. I didn't know who I was praying to. God? Jonathan? All I knew was that I hoped that if I prayed and begged hard enough, Jonathan would be spared. This could even be a good thing. I could be his nurse. He would be in no condition to take care of himself, and I would have what? 1, maybe 2 weeks of him needing me? If I can't convince him to forgive me in that time, then things are beyond repair. The journey seemed to take forever. I have no idea how I made it there in one piece, with tears clouding my vision. Finding parking near the hospital was a nightmare, as usual. Luckily, the ER was well signposted. The bored-looking nurse at triage took her sweet time getting the details from a mother and her child. Why bother? The child only had a scraped knee, obvious by the way he was kicking the chair leg. When it was finally my turn, the nurse took my name, made a quick phone call, then told me to wait with the rest. I must have sat there for almost an hour, assuming they were busy admitting Jonathan after stabilizing him. Luckily, I had grabbed a spare phone charger on the way out of the house, and there was a convenient wall socket in the ER. I distracted myself by searching for information on post-heart attack care and some other topics I wasn't particularly proud of at the time, but I believe in being thorough. I read about stents and bypasses. All seemed to require 2+ weeks of bed rest. The triage nurse herself came and woke me up. I was taken through the doors between the waiting room and the ER itself. She didn't say much as she led me into a small office just inside the doors. Sitting there was a tired-looking man in a white coat, presumably a doctor. He got up when I arrived, so he must be old-fashioned. The woman in her 50s who was with him remained seated. Once I sat down, I prepared myself to hear the diagnosis, armed with all my newfound knowledge. The events that followed are blurry at best. Somewhere in the first sentence, the phrase "dead on arrival" was mentioned. I have no idea whether or not I actually hit the floor. Strangely, I felt like I was falling for a long time. All my inadequate worst-case scenarios from earlier in the day flooded my brain with a loud rush. Dave, I was absolutely exhausted when the phone call woke me from dozing. It was just after 9 a.m., and it was Carly, Jonathan's daughter, confirming I had heard the news and asking me to come to their dad's house. Oh yes, I had heard the news all right. That's why I had hardly slept a wink. Yet, as the first glimmer of dawn turned the world pink, I knew I wasn't to blame for my friend's death. How? Jonathan told me. Unable to sleep, I had quietly gotten out of bed to avoid waking Belinda. I checked my emails and phone for messages, something I hadn't had time to do the night before. There was a voicemail, time-stamped 4:55 the previous afternoon, from Jonathan. Feeling like I was reaching out to the afterlife, I pressed the button to listen to what he had left. It was short, simple, and came from a man obviously in pain. "Thanks for being a true friend, buddy. Goodbye." I went back to bed and crawled into Belinda's arms. She held me while I mourned a great man. Belinda accompanied me to Jonathan's house, and our suspicions about why they wanted me there were almost correct. I say they because Jared had managed to catch the midnight flight from Perth and joined Carly at their childhood home. They wanted to know what had caused their father's death, and like many who had recently lost someone, find someone to blame. After confirming that Jonathan had emailed them before the hospital called to inform them of their father's death, and that their mother was still at the hospital, sedated, Belinda and I put together a timeline for them. Belinda had made good time to John's house and noticed his car was there, but nobody answered the doorbell. She took the liberty of walking around the house and looking through windows. That's when she saw him lying on the floor. Luckily, the back door was open, so she hurried inside. Jonathan was on the floor, holding the house phone in one hand and, oddly enough, the answering machine in the other. Belinda couldn't find a pulse. She rolled him onto his back with one hand while calling emergency services with the other. The operator walked her through performing CPR. By the time the ambulance arrived, she was nearly exhausted, estimating that it had been about 10 minutes since she started. They moved the furniture out of the way and set up an AED. At that point, Belinda left the room to call me. By the time we calmed each other down, the EMTs had Jonathan on a stretcher and were on their way to the hospital. I asked Belinda to go back into John's study and describe the scene. Her description led to her following the ambulance to the hospital, with the back seat of her car filled with John's cell phone, the answering machine tape, an envelope containing a legal document, my email to Jonathan with attachments, and a signed email she found next to the keyboard on the desk. As for me, I was on my way back to Brisbane Airport and the next flight home. Belinda met me at the airport with news that wasn't a huge surprise. While she was sitting in the ER, a woman she recognized as Priscilla came in and started playing on her phone. After almost an hour, Priscilla was led away and never returned. Belinda pressed the ER nurse for information, and only after revealing that she was the one who had performed CPR and called for help did she receive any details. Even then, it was just a vague statement about the woman being admitted and sedated after receiving devastating news. The timeline we pieced together showed that Jonathan had been busy in the last half hour of his life. Some of the details were educated guesses due to the circumstances. I called him at 4:31, then he would have read my email. There, on the desk, were the printed photos. After that, he probably looked in the filing cabinet for his prenup with Priscilla that was the legal document in the envelope. We read it together, and it spelled out, among other things, that a cheating party in the marriage left with nothing but their personal possessions. Not surprising, when you consider how his first marriage exploded. From there, he'd written a one-page email to his kids, in which he expressed his love for them and the grandchildren, born and unborn. He then detailed my call and email that's how they'd come across my name. He apologized for the impending divorce and how ruthlessly he intended to treat their mother. Their mother, he told them, knew his views on unfaithfulness, and so she shouldn't be surprised he was going to enforce the prenup rigorously. The counterpoint was he intended to look after them and leave all his worldly goods to them instead of her. All through the text shone his love for them, but a growing bitterness toward their mother. The evidence of loathing staggered his kids. They understood a lot better after I related the untold story of their father's first wife and my own experience of love being shunted to hate. The dread introspection as a person realizes that all they'd taken as gospel for years was a lie. That their memories were sullied, their dreams shattered. Bizarrely, a signed and dated copy of the email had been among the documents Belinda grabbed. Beside the clear signature was some illegible scrawl. We guessed he was in severe pain from his heart as he wrote it. The bizarreness reduced after my lawyer, who answered his phone on a Saturday, responded to some questions from me. The only time reference we could use to estimate the timeline was the message Jonathan left on my voicemail. We estimated his heart stopped during, or shortly after, Priscilla's confession, which we all listened to. We might have missed this bit of evidence had his clutching of the recorder not alerted Belinda to its existence. Once we had an approximation of the order of events, I felt it was time for Belinda and me to leave the siblings. They probably had things they wanted to discuss in private. Just as I turned to signal Belinda, we all heard a car pull up outside. As our heads turned to the window, Priscilla was exiting her BMW. Priscilla, same as in the hospital, I delayed opening my eyes. When would the nightmare end? The sound of the front door opening and closing made me cringe, and I scrunched my eyes even tighter shut. I'd never felt so alone and isolated in my life. The nightmare started when I woke to the cleaner in my hospital room, clattering away and making a racket. I winced from the jarring noise. I cautiously opened my eyes, squinting at the bright glare bouncing off the ultra-white ceiling. Turning my head to the side, I blinked repeatedly in an effort to speed up my adjustment to the light. I groaned, my head ached. It felt fuzzy, like I was trying to think through a wad of cotton wool. Why was I in the hospital? And then it all flooded back. Jonathan was gone. Dead. I'd never feel his arms around me again. Never see his smile or hear him laugh. The love of my life gone. I couldn't bear it. Hot tears spilled over. I felt the panic start in the small of my back, growing and gathering momentum as it moved up my spine. The sound of an animal in pain pierced my brain. It took a moment for me to realize it was me. I was the animal shrieking in agony. I thrashed, fighting the bed covers. Arms restrained me. Here, take these, Mrs. Carstairs. I turned my head back and forth, avoiding the rim of the plastic cup, at the same time as I pushed the proffered hand away. Escape. I had to escape my new reality. SSS, calm down. Take these and you'll feel better. Like a puppet whose strings are cut, I sagged, unable to support my own weight. The nurse held the cup and tablets out to me again, and I obediently sipped and swallowed. Within a matter of minutes, calm washed over me, seeing I was no longer a threat to myself or anyone else. The nurse patted my arm, encouraging me to recline against the multitude of pillows she'd stacked behind my back. Someone will be in shortly to make sure you're okay. Just rest until then. I did as instructed, calm but desolate. Jonathan was gone. Forever. My mind shied away from why. How long I waited to be released, I wasn't sure. Time had no meaning. Everything I did was done on autopilot. My only aim was to get myself home, somewhere familiar, somewhere where I could cry. I knew I needed to cry myself out before I tried again to phone Carly and Jared. Perhaps it was just as well they hadn't answered their phones when I'd attempted earlier. Seeing Carly's car in the driveway gave me pause. I realized the hospital must have phoned her. My emotions were mixed relief I wasn't the one who would have to break the devastating news and dread having to face her, knowing she knew something of my mistake. For the second time in 24 hours, I walked the path to my front door like a condemned man. I let myself in and did a double take. Not only was Carly sitting in the living room, but Jared also. The biggest surprise, though, was the presence of Dave and a blonde woman I didn't recognize and could only surmise was his wife. I waited for my children to come and give me a hug and was confused when they remained seated. Both just stared at me, condemningly. I was struck mute, skewered to where I stood. After closing the front door behind them, Jared returned to the lounge and sat where he'd been before. Carly avoided my gaze the whole time he was away. I was just confused. Jared exchanged a look with Carly. She nodded, indicating her younger brother was to be the spokesman. Mother. As you know, I'm the executor of Father's will, and I have to tell you that after discussing things with my sister and others, I intend to act on Dad's last wish and enforce the terms of the prenuptial agreement you both signed all those years ago, particularly the part of it that says you leave with nothing. Jared was waiving the prenup. His speech was mostly dispassionate, and he only looked at me when he said, with emphasis, the word you. His eyes blazed. I was bewildered. Yes, I'd made a mistake. It happened to the best of us. Why the hate? What did they know? It couldn't be much. I'd gone to Brisbane, and they held photos of me hugging Paul. I responded automatically. I hadn't been mentally idle in the last half day. Forget the prenup. It's only relevant if I made a mistake. So, I went to Brisbane and was caught hugging another man. What does that prove? Carly leaned over to the coffee table, picked something up and waved it at me. Damn, it was the tape from the answering machine. The one with my confession almost certainly on it. Things were spiraling out of control. I had to rein them in. Look, children. Not that it has anything to do with you, but you should know I've done my research. Even if I can't get that ancient prenup overturned, then the law is clear. Unless specifically excluded, everything of your father's comes to me as per the terms of his last will and testament. Carly leapt to her feet, eyes bulging in anger. Nothing to do with us? Nothing to do with us? You wicked witch. Jared interrupted his sister by the simple expedient of rising and wrapping her in his arms. I envied her that human contact. He made SSSing noises until her sobbing abated, then returned his attention to me. Maybe you're referring to the will we found in the filing cabinet. Updated about 5 years ago. That the one? Let me read you something. He picked up what I recognized as the email Jonathan sent the kids the previous afternoon. I stood there, head bowed, as he outlined what Jonathan knew and how he'd found out. I cringed as it degenerated into a diatribe of hate, all aimed at me. My mind flashed back to the pain Jonathan had been in when I first met him. How wary and reluctant to trust. How the hell had I managed to forget that? My mind kept trying to make a connection, but my self-preservation continually stopped it. I forced myself to listen to Jared. He'd put the awful email down again. This email outlines Dad's final wishes. As you can see, he took the time to print and sign it. There, see? That confused us until Dave rang his lawyer. By signing it, it became a new last will and testament. Yes, Mother, you could fight it in the prenup in court, but I'll give you fair warning, Carly, and I will fight you every step of the way in disbelief. I looked at Carly. She nodded agreement. This couldn't be true. Couldn't be happening. Why? Carly disengaged herself from her brother and stepped into my face. Mom, we were raised with the story of how you met Dad, how he took us in when we were on the streets. In a way, that made us love him even more than if he were our biological dad. He chose to do it all with, and for us rather than treat raising us as an obligation. I have more childhood memories of Dad playing with me, of helping me with my homework, of teaching me to ride a bike, swim, and drive a car than I do you. I am the person I am today, and I think Jared would say the same, because of him, not you. You were always too busy with your friends. You never wanted to get your clothes rumpled or your hair messed. We owe everything to him, and so do you. He loved us all with everything he had. Even you can't deny that. Dave told us about Dad's first marriage and how it almost destroyed him. You were there. You knew exactly what being unfaithful would do, yet you did it anyway. But I didn't think. I never thought. It just happened. You're talking like I'm an evil witch that destroyed your father deliberately. Yet you talk to that jerk Dave like he's your new best buddy. He killed your father. Jared stepped right next to his sister and glared at me with a malevolence that was like a physical push. No, Mother. Dave didn't harm Dad. You did. Your stabbing him in the stomach and twisting the knife was what did it. The truth of this struck a chord within me, but before fully accepting its truth, my automatic defense mechanisms kicked in. Like a lifeless body twitching for a few seconds after its demise. You shouldn't pay attention to what he wrote in that darn email. He was hurt in the heat of the moment. Your father loved me. Jared moved closer. Yes, he did. And yes, he spoke out of anger. Picture yourself sitting there, knowing you're having a heart attack. How much intense hatred does it take to compose an email, print it, and even sign it when you could be calling an ambulance for yourself? That's how important his final words were to him. He risked his life for them. That's what I don't understand. How could he die from a heart attack? He was incredibly strong. God, he only had a medical checkup 4 months ago, and the doctor told him he was in great shape for someone his age. It's interesting you mentioned that, Mother. We asked the hospital that very question. You know what they told us? The bitter sarcasm in Carly's voice made me flinch as I shook my head. Shock, Mother. Shock. Your betrayal deeply affected him and shattered his already fragile heart. Your selfishness, your vanity, your foolishness, as you so eloquently expressed in your confession, completely crushed him. My children and Jared's will never know their grandfather because of you, and I can never forgive you for that. I took a step back as if pushed. Jared, seemingly tied to my side, stepped forward. I will believe until the day I die that Dad's final words to us meant more to him than his own survival. I have to believe that because the alternative is just too terrible. Carly turned to him questioningly. Yes, the alternative. That he knew the pain of betrayal that was about to hit him from someone he trusted. He knew the level of agony that awaited and intentionally didn't call an ambulance for himself. If I believed that even for a second, I might never sleep again. To think that he would choose to never meet his grandchildren or have them know him. It's just too horrifying to imagine. Carly whimpered, sinking back into the armchair, her face pale. Jared stood beside her and placed his hand on her shoulder, giving it a comforting squeeze before refocusing his attention on me. So, Mother, we will honor our father's final wishes with the same passion he had. And that is all I remember for a very, very long time. Epilogue. Priscilla seated on the couch, Surrounded by packing crates, my eyes landed on the small plastic container that held a portion of Jonathan's ashes. I couldn't gaze at it for long. It was too painful and unreal. How could something so small, so ordinary, hold the remains of someone as remarkable as Jonathan? I needed to move. I stood up and stretched my legs, then wandered aimlessly from one packed box to the next, running my fingers along their edges. So little, really, from such a long, fulfilling, and meaningful life together. I suppose I should consider myself fortunate that the kids were allowing me to take as much as they were. They could have limited me to only my clothing and toiletries. After circling the room, I stopped in front of the wall where a beautiful antique sideboard had once stood. I studied the faint outline of where we used to hang a print of our wedding. The one with Carly nestled in Jonathan's arm, his other arm around my waist, while Jared stood proudly in front of us. All of us smiling, radiating happiness. Now the empty wall, with its ghostly trace of a frame, spoke more strongly to me than any words could, conveying the emptiness of my future. I sighed, feeling weary and sad. I found myself caught between a rock and a hard place. I had an impossible decision to make. I could comply with Jonathan's final wishes and leave without putting up a fight, in the hope that one day my children would forgive me and allow me back into their lives. That option meant facing poverty. My work skills, aside from homemaking, were non-existent. I wasn't yet old enough to receive a pension, but I was too old to be truly competitive in the job market without qualifications. The other option was to fight against my own children in court, knowing that doing so would mean losing Carly and Jared and their families forever. And of course it would mean going against Jonathan's dying wish. Both choices were dreadful. I could blame Dave for telling Jonathan. I could blame Jerome, my first husband, for leaving me without any explanation. I could blame hormones or aging or Paul for taking advantage of an emotionally vulnerable older woman. Heck, many psychologists might say I could blame my mother for dying when I was so young, or my father for being distant and uncaring. But the truth was, yes, I could finally admit it, I only had myself to blame. Nobody forced me to respond to Paul's flattery. Nobody forced me to jump into bed with him. Nobody forced me to lie and cheat and betray someone I had vowed to love exclusively for the rest of my life. I made those choices. And now I had to live with the repercussions.